Yesterday in our exhortation we talked about Introduction to Joshua and how he's this warrior that bursts onto the scene and engages in this spiritual warfare for his ecclesia, leading by example, gathering the people together and helping them to fight against this common cause, this common enemy that the nation had. Right? You could easily look outward and say, that there's the problem. Amalek's surrounding us, they're picking on our people, they're an issue. Right? And Joshua leapt up to that battle and led the people. In today's class, we're going to look at the story of Joshua going up the mountain with Moses, the whole golden calf issue. And what we're going to see is that, again, the first issue with Joshua is external, it's easy to identify, but this is an ecclesial problem. The golden calf didn't come from outside the ecclesia necessarily. Influences did, but it was inside our ecclesia. It was with our brothers and sisters. Now Joshua has to rise up and help with that particular problem. And it's a different monster, isn't it? It's a different challenge that we face. All right, when we have to deal with our brothers and sisters, we have to work out the right principles to manifest the character of God. So we'll see that hopefully today as we look at the idea of Joshua the servant, and then we'll wrap it up a little bit looking in Numbers at Joshua the shepherd, as he is given this charge from Moses to lead the people into the promised land. As Moses understands that he's not going to go into the promised land, he anoints Joshua as his successor, and Joshua is given this command to be a shepherd, and he leads the people obviously into Canaan. So we have a bit of a timeline that we're going through. They left Egypt, obviously, in the first month, 14th day, and that's a Passover time. And then we have them entering the wilderness of Sin and their arrival at Sinai. So yesterday's class takes place sometime between the first year, second month, 15th day, and the first year, third month, 14th day. And I would suggest it happens sometime during the Feast of Weeks, maybe even on the day of Pentecost itself, when Joshua chooses out his people to fight against the Amalekites. And then today, as we've arrived at Mount Sinai, you can imagine the relief of the people. They've come to the Mount of God. They're all settled in, and they stay there for quite a while. Pretty much a year they stay here at Mount Sinai. And while they're at Mount Sinai, Moses begins these trips up the mountain. He goes up the mountain, talks to God, comes back down, communicates to the people, and it goes up and down, and you can imagine the people just waiting patiently at the bottom to hear God's word, to hear Moses deliver the message, as Moses continues up and down. And we look at these different trips that Moses makes up the mountain. And there are 7 of them in total, beginning obviously in Exodus 19, and we're going to end that in Exodus 34 after the incident with the golden calf. And each of these trips, Moses is learning different things. Because we think about the ecclesia, right, Israel in the wilderness, it's how God formed the ecclesia. All those trials and challenges they went through helped them become one ecclesia, band together, right? By the common sufferings, by the common challenges that they face. So these trips up the mountain is teaching Moses and the people how they can go through these different things. So we're going to focus in this class on the 5th trip up the mountain, which is Exodus 24, verse 12 to 32:15. And that is the idea of the pattern of the ecclesia, because that's the trip when Moses goes up the mountain. Yes, he receives the 10 commandments, but he's also given all the information about the tabernacle, right? And we know that tabernacle becomes a pattern of our discipleship, and the pattern of our ecclesial life. So Moses receives that information, and as he comes down the mountain, we know the story so very well, the people have been distracted, as it were. They have gone astray. So we'll pick up our story in Exodus 24, when Moses first goes up. So Exodus 24, verses 12 and 13. Yahweh says to Moses, "Come up to me in the mount, be there, and I will give thee tables of stone, a law, and commandments, which I have written. Thou mayst teach them." And Moses rose up, and his minister Joshua. So first thing, recognize that these things that Moses was going up to hear from God, whether it's the commandments, the law, etc., these were things that he had to then teach his brothers and sisters. He had to teach the ecclesia. And that word teach is the word yara, and teaching in Hebrew has the idea of to flow like water. And we think about how water flows. So if I get any shape of a container that I want, I can get a container shaped like a flamingo, and I pour water in, the water's going to go into every nook and cranny of that container, regardless of the shape. So when God talks about teaching us things, what he's saying is, I want you to flow like water and fulfill a shape. Right? There's a structure to what God is doing. And the shape we know we have to fill is God. Right? We have to be taught and molded and fitting the shape, right? The stamp of God's character, his way of life. So as Moses is going up and down the mountain, learning all these different principles and patterns, he's then taking them down to the nation and helping them understand the form that they need to manifest or reflect back to God. And so that's what Moses has done. He's bringing down this information in Exodus 24 to 32, and he's going to teach them all about how to build God's house, as it were. Now, this is the 5th time Moses has gone up the mountain. Up until this point, it's just Moses going up the mountain talking with God. Right? But this time, he takes Joshua. Right? The pattern changed. And you can imagine all these elders, all these heads of the families, right? They're looking and they're waiting every time. You're taking Joshua? That younger man, 40-ish? Are you taking him up the mountain? Well, why am I not going? So from this early stage, we see that Moses, obviously from the direction of God, has identified Joshua as a very important character. I think from this early stage, I believe Moses understood that Joshua would take over for him afterwards. Obviously, Moses, at this point, still believed he would go into the promised land, but Joshua was meant to be his successor. Right? And so Moses begins this role of a mentor with Joshua. I mean, think about ecclesial life and this idea of mentoring. We have all these elders in our ecclesias, whether they're older brothers, older sisters, and they often take on the role of mentoring young people. And what's interesting, we think about that role of mentorship. We often talk about how we encourage young people, reach out to your elders, give them a phone call, go talk with them, get their advice, right? And we're always encouraging our young people to go and talk to the aged. And that encouragement is really, really good. And it should continue on. But looking at the scriptural example, it's almost never the young brother who starts the relationship. It's always the elder reaching out to the younger. Right? We see it really clearly with Jonathan and David. Right? David was just awestruck that Jonathan would come and talk to him and it would take him under his wing. Right? Because as a young person, sometimes the elder, even though he has the old person and their old fuddy-duddy, but it's a bit intimidating. Right? They've been through so much. They have so many responsibilities. Right? They're this picture of responsibility and authority in the ecclesia. It's intimidating to approach those people. So that's why the scriptural example is that you reach out to them. You initiate the conversation. They need to respond, just as we need to respond to God reaching out to us. But that mentorship has to be driven by the people in this room, not the people in the room across the way. Right? We have to be the one that reaches out to the people, knowing to the next generation, and initiate those conversations. Right? Follow up with them. Believe me, they get distracted really easily. Well, then we follow up, and we help realign that situation, and we make that relationship work. And Moses is doing that with Joshua. He's taking him under his wing, and the whole time through the wilderness, he's preparing him for the role that he would take. And we want our young people to take on these roles, don't we? We want the ecclesia to continue to grow, to flourish. That happens when they're young. We prepare them for these roles. In the same way, the same pattern that God is using our lives to prepare us for the roles in the kingdom. Right? We're just imitating what God does. We're following his set patterns. And that's what Moses is doing here with Joshua as he brings them up the mountain. Now, the other thing to notice as Joshua is brought up in verse 13, Moses rose up and his minister, Joshua. The word there, minister, just means to be a menial task worker or a worshiper. It has this idea of service, of serving. Now, again, think about what Joshua had been going through. All right? A few months prior, he'd been called to the front to organize this battle and fight against the Amalekites. We know the story. Moses was standing on the hilltop. But to the people in that battle, it was Joshua who was leading them. Right? To the people at home, they knew it was Joshua who was organizing the defense of the nation. He was a war hero. Someone that you recognized. Oh, there's Joshua. He's the hero. Look what he did. It's amazing. Right? He would stand out. Right? But yet here he is described as a servant. Because even in those moments when we step to the front and we engage in that positive example for our brothers and sisters. There's those moments when you do step into the limelight, as it were, in ecclesial life. Right? You face into a challenge. You're able to deal with a problem, to set an example, a tone with your brothers and sisters, with the young people. And we know how dangerous that is for us, because what comes next? Well, I'm pretty good. I deserve this. I deserve a lot more, actually. And the ego just grows and grows and grows. But we can't be like that, because that role that Joshua performed back in Exodus 17 was the role of a servant. Right? He was asked to do something. And we can't forget that no matter what we're doing in the ecclesia, no matter what we're asked to do, it's service. And that's the point. Joshua was not memorialized as the mighty man of valor. He's memorialized as the servant. And it's mentioned 4 times where Joshua is called the servant. Here in Exodus 24, then again in 33, Numbers 11, and Joshua 1, verse 1. He is called a servant over and over again. And we have to remind ourselves that whatever we're doing in ecclesial life, it is the role of a servant. It's service to our brothers and sisters, service to our Heavenly Father, service to those who are trying to bring into the truth. It's always serving in the truth. And we know the disciples had this problem. Our minds think about the examples with the disciples wanting to be the best and the greatest. Mark 9, and they held their peace, for by the way they disputed among themselves that who should be the greatest, who should be the Joshua, who can be the war hero. And Christ sat down and called the 12 and saith unto them, if any man desire to be first, the same shall be last and servant of all. That's the point. We need to make sure we are willing to serve in God's house. Regardless of what he's asked to do, it's God asking. The role is amazingly important because he's asking you to do it. We should jump to this idea of service. And it's not like we're different than God's other servants, are we? The angels are servants to God. He sees them the same way. Right? We're not grasping at something less. Psalm 104 and 4, who maketh his angels spirits as ministers, that same word sharath, a flaming fire. So Joshua the minister, the servant, is like the angels who are also ministers and servants. Psalm 103 and 21, bless you, Yahweh, all you his hosts, you ministers of his, that do his pleasure. So if we want to be God's ministers, his servants, we need to do his pleasure. It's not serving in the way that we think we ought to, right? Doing what I think we can do it this way. It'd be a lot better, right? We need to update our way of thinking. We need to change with the times. No, if we want to be God's servants, we do his pleasure. Not our own, not the world, not somebody else's. It remains to be our master's pleasure, right? If we want to be his servants. We read in Psalm 101 about this idea of service. Mine eye shall be upon the faithful of the land, that they may dwell with me. He that walketh in a perfect way, he shall serve me. So in order to serve God, we need to walk in this perfect way. God has a standard for his servants. He's an employer, and he's hiring what he's looking for. Right? He's looking for training, quality, attributes, characteristics. If we want to be his servant, we need to meet those qualities, attributes, and characteristics. The word there for perfect is the word tamim, and it means to be entire, whether literally or figuratively or morally, integrity and truth, without blemish, complete, full, perfect, sincerity, sound, etc. It's this idea of being morally upright. We're making the effort to fit into, remember, God's mold, the shape that he is trying to teach us to be like. Water, right? It can flow. It can be molded. We need to be like that, and God is looking for that in his service, in his servants. And we think about this idea of God's servants in Scripture. This word sharath that we're considering at the moment is used multiple times in Scripture, but 85 to 90% of the time the word is used, it's talking about very specific service. It's talking about the service of the Levites and the service of the priesthood. There's a few examples on the slide. When they go into the tabernacle of the congregation, they shall wash with water. They die not when they come near to the altar to minister. Talking about the priests. 1 Chronicles 15, David said, none ought to carry the ark but the Levites, for them hath Yahweh chosen to carry the ark of God and to minister unto him forever. Ezekiel 45 and 4, we're looking forward now to the kingdom. The holy portion of the land shall be for the priests, the ministers of the sanctuary, which shall come near to minister unto Yahweh. So this idea of service, this ministering, is specific, right? There's lots of words God uses for service in Scripture, but this particular one is closely associated, identifies with the service of the priesthood. And here is Joshua being called to that particular service. Right? Joshua is being asked to be a servant, a minister, and maybe we'll see a priest as well as he works in the life of his brothers and sisters. So here's Joshua and Moses up on the mountain. They were there for quite a long time. It was a long trip up the mountain this time. And we know down below, people are getting edgy, distracted. They're starting to doubt. They make their golden calf. And God warns Moses, and we come over to Exodus 32. They start to come down the mountain. Let's come to Exodus 32. And pick up in verse 17. And when Joshua heard the noise of the people as they shouted, he said to Moses, there was the noise of war in the camp. So here is the mighty man, the war hero. He hears this grumbling and roaring down in the camp, and his mind goes to battle. There's a war again. Someone's coming. The Amalekites are back. The Egyptians have caught up. Whatever it might be, there's a war down in the camp. I need to get down there. I need to rally the troops. I need to defend my brothers and sisters. There's Joshua's mindset. And it's a wonderful mindset to have. Right? There's a battle that is going on down in the camp. But then we see Moses' recognition. Now obviously Moses had the benefit of God's communication a few moments earlier when God told him there was a problem. The people had gone a-whoring. And here's Moses' reaction. In verse 18, he says to Joshua, it is not the voice of them that shout for mastery, neither is it the voice of them that cry for being overcome, but it's the noise of them that sing do I hear. Moses recognized it's not a war going on down there. There's not a battle for mastery as in overcoming your enemy. It's the cry of them that have already been overcome. It's the cry of singing and rejoicing. That word mastery, the word Gibora, it means victory and valor. See, that is what Moses should have heard. Moses should have heard a cry for victory. Victory over those who wanted to set up a golden calf, who wanted to lead the ecclesia astray. That should have been a problem identified by others. There should have been a conflict existing down below. But there wasn't. There was an absence of conflict, wasn't there? There was no one striving to deal with the issue of that golden calf. There was a lack of battle. It's the cry of them that were being overcome. Those who were being defeated. The ecclesia was losing the battle. They weren't fighting back. They weren't fighting that spiritual warfare against the corruption of Egypt in that calf. Rather, they were being overcome. That word, kalusha, came up earlier in our story. It came up back in Exodus 17. And Joshua discomfited Amalek. See, that's the response we need to have when our ecclesial life is threatened. When the truth is threatened by human nature, by the flesh. We need to overcome it. We need to fight back against it. But in this story in Exodus 32, 33, the ecclesia wasn't fighting. It was being overcome by the world. As opposed to Exodus 17, when they overcame the Amalekites. And we need to overcome, don't we, brothers and sisters? That's what Christ's rallying cry is to us. His motivational speech. We think of the letters to the ecclesia in Revelation. It's repeated time and time again. To him that overcometh. To him that fights back against Amalek. Revelation 3 verse 12, him that overcometh will I make a pillar in the temple of my God, and he shall go no more out. And I will write upon him the name of my God, and the name of the city of my God. The ones that overcome will dwell with God forever. They won't leave God's house. Joshua was one who overcame. And we continue through the story. We have the whole thing about the Levites standing up and Moses removing the tabernacle out of the camp. And what does Joshua do? Verse 11 of chapter 33. And Yahweh spake to Moses face to face as a man speaketh to his friend. And he turned again into the camp. But his servant Joshua, the son of Nun, a young man, departed not out of the tabernacle. To him that overcome will not depart from my house. That's what we're fighting towards. That's what we are striving to do. To dwell in God's house forever. Now this tabernacle we speak there of in verse 11 of Exodus 33 is not the tabernacle that they build later on in the book. This was a tent of meeting where God would commune with Moses. And that's where Joshua went, and Joshua stayed. Interesting enough, Joshua is mentioned 7 times in the book of Exodus. 7 times, that number of completion. The number that points towards God's plan and purpose with the earth. The first time we have Joshua mentioned was back yesterday in verse 9 of chapter 17, when he fought against Amalek. That's the necessary first step in our lives, in God's working with, is that we need to recognize the need to fight against the flesh. The 7th and final time that Joshua is mentioned is there in verse 11 of chapter 33. Because if we want to end up there, dwelling in God's house forever, it begins with the battle against Amalek. It's a necessary first step in God bringing us into his house, into his family, into his embrace as a father, and we his children. So we see in that work that God does with Joshua, he ends up in the house, and he stays there. He doesn't depart. And we talked about a bit earlier about this idea of the pattern that God was giving to Moses and to all of us, really. This pattern of ecclesial life, the pattern of the function of how we work together to manifest God. And we talked about how this trip up the mountain was very specific. It was the idea of the pattern of the ecclesia. It's when God says to Moses, all right, you're going to build all this stuff. And it's very specific. So while he's up there on the mountain, we read in verse 9 of Exodus 25, God clearly says to Moses, according to all that I show thee, after the pattern of the tabernacle and the pattern of all the instruments thereof. So God lays it out for Moses. There's going to be a pattern. That word pattern, tabinith, it's the idea of a model, a figure. Right? We follow the blueprint that laid out. God is very clear. There is a blueprint that God has set out for us. So while God is telling Moses, here is the blueprint, here's the pattern by which you can dwell with me, serve me, work with me that I may work with you. Meanwhile, down the hill, down the mountain, Israel is rebelling at that thought, and we have a different pattern being laid out. Exodus 32 and 24, I said unto them, whoever hath any gold, let them break it off. So they gave it to me, cast into the fire, and poof, there came out this calf. I find it interesting. Obviously, they had to plan out how the golden calf looked like. It wasn't just going to magically appear into a calf shape. But in the record, there's no pattern. It just poof comes out. Because God is all about this idea of structure. Everything with God has structure and purpose. Us, you and I, are naturally chaotic. We're anti-structure. We don't want rules and regulations. We don't want to be told what to do, where to go. We just want to do what we want. Leave me alone. Let me make my own choices. But God is completely the opposite. Everything with God has a pattern, and everything fits perfectly together. And there's a blueprint throughout this word that tells us how we then can get from where we are today, fighting against Amalek, to dwelling with God forever. God has laid out every step along the way. Right? We take anything out of that blueprint of that engine, we take out the pistons, or I don't know much about cars, whatever part you take out, spark plugs, it doesn't work so well. Right? If you think of Brother Jeff or Brother Mark or Brother Dave when they're in their construction business and they're building a house, they have a pattern. They don't get to choose to deviate from that pattern. Right? They don't get to make things go on these weird off angles. Right? So when it finishes up, it stands firm. That's how God is. God is patterned. And we see it in every aspect of creation. In Sunday school, our teacher, Brother Peter, used to always talk about the woodpecker. He's usually to evolution, but the pattern of the woodpecker, he'd always talk about it. Because everything the woodpecker has is necessary for it to survive and live and function. Right? From the beak. It has to be hard enough, right? So as it's jackhammering into the wood, it doesn't break. Right? The skull then has to be like a helmet and absorb all that pounding. The neck has to have shock absorbers. Its tongue has to roll around its head so that it can get into the wood. Its feet have to be strong enough. Its tail feathers have to be tight enough. All those things have to work together. If you take any part of the pattern away, the woodpecker doesn't work. It falls apart. God's like that with everything. Everything with God has a pattern, down to our ecclesial life. There's a structure and a pattern to what we do together. And when we deviate off that pattern, make a ripple, we might not see the change right away, but we will see that change, and it will start to pull away from the pattern. Things will start to not function as well as they should, as well as God intended them to be. And we see those things, right? We need to then deal with them, right? The pattern has been deviated from. Okay, let's get back, figure out where the problem was, have a chat about it, fix it, move on. That's what God hopes for us to do. Because God has structure despite our need and our desire for chaos. There's nothing chaotic in nature. Man, right? Think of even art. So for a long time, man would draw a picture and they'd look at something and they'd draw it. And then comes along, man wants to do whole abstract stuff and doing blobs and change the features and elongate things. They want to change it because they didn't want to work within the pattern and structure, the beauty, the good creation that God had done. We always want to bust out. We want to break loose. And if we don't recognize that about ourselves, then we won't see the breaks in the pattern. We won't understand why it matters. We have to realize that we want to break the pattern. It's a problem that we all have. And if we can identify that problem in ourselves, and we can see the issue that's happened, hopefully we can fix it together. Because think about work days. You all get together and you all fix something together. It can be a unifying effort to fix the problem in the pattern. What a wonderful opportunity for ecclesial life. Not only are we fixing the long-term strength of the ecclesia, but we're unifying our brothers and sisters and working together to fix the problem. Everything works for good when we try to do what God asks us to do. So there was a problem in the pattern of this ecclesia. When Moses and Joshua up the mountain, they deviated. They went their own way. Instead of building a house for God, they built a golden calf. And nobody was fighting back. They were being overcome by that example. And Moses comes down the mountain with Joshua. And we read in Exodus 32, and verse 26 and 27, Moses stood in the gate of the camp and said, "Who is on Yahweh's side? Let him come unto me." And all the sons of Levi gathered themselves together unto him. And he said unto them, "Thus saith Yahweh, God of Israel, put every man his sword by his side, go in and out from gate to gate throughout the camp, slay every man his brother, every man his companion, and every man his neighbor." Now we can read that story detachedly. Oh, wow, it's a golden calf. Like, it's terrible. They need to deal with that problem. Good, they got rid of the issue. But read it from today, like from our perspective. They weren't fighting the Amalekites here. This was an internal ecclesial problem. This is the problem between brothers and sisters, between